everything around you seems to be going down. When you fall from your grace, and everything around you seems to be falling down, that joy and abundance is coming down your way. Joy and abundance is coming down your way. Joy, 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 joy and abundance is coming down your way. Joy and abundance is coming down your way. Joy, joy, joy and abundance is coming your way. It's coming your way. I said, coming down. Joy and abundance is coming down. Joy and abundance is coming down your way. It's 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 coming down your way. Joy and abundance is coming down your way. It's coming down your way.
Coming down your way.
Joy and abundance is coming down your way. Joy and abundance is coming down your way.
Brother Bunolo on drums. Having a good time wherever you are. We feel you even though we can't see you.
Molweni, and welcome all. Welcome to our second installment of Intersect. AfrikaBurn is a series of discussions that we're having over three parts. And this particular one is called Incubating the Arts. First, please note that this session is being recorded. So if you're uncomfortable with being recorded, you can simply watch via YouTube or Facebook or wherever else you can join, and it will be recorded, so you can actually even watch it later, so that you don't have to be recorded if you're uncomfortable. So welcome to Incubating the Arts. Last week we spoke, it was very transformational. It was very much about incubation about transformation in the arts. We really looked into the mirror. It was all about reflecting on our own practices and so forth. And what are we doing? What is this whole AfrikaBurn thing about? You know, we spoke all about that. So today we are incubating the arts. And so we're looking at this, at AfrikaBurn, this public arts festival, as this incubator of the arts, where, as you see now with the video, incredible artwork has been birthed and born out of this festival. So without further ado, I'll actually introduce my speakers tonight. I'm sure you all know Monique Schiess and Lorraine Tanner from AB, who'll be joining us today. We've got our new NED, Ralph Borland, as well, who's going to be joining us. He's our public arts expert. And we've got Monwabisi Solitude, that you guys have all seen around the player, of course, and in and around Muizenberg, Eastern Cape, Cape Town. He's just that guy. And then, of course, we've got so we've got Mr. Nathan Honey. Okay, so we've all seen his incredible artwork, and he's going to be talking a lot about like some of the projects he's done in terms of like skills transfer, working with youth from marginalized communities and trying to get them into the arts as well. And yeah, so he's really just our art expert at the moment. Well, everybody is on this platform, but yeah, we've got Nathan Honey, and lastly we've got Mr. Stephen Sack. Thank you, darling. And Stephen. Yeah, so he's coming from a government perspective. He's been in the industry and he's really going to be talking about the history of the arts. I'll allow Monique and Lorraine just to quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to the other three, ending off with Mr. Stephen Sack. Thank you. Monique?
Hi, so I'm Monique. You just want us to tell her who we are and what our roles are, right, Cindy?
Yes, you can. Just tell us who you are, what your role is.
Oh, okay, yeah. So my
anything.
Sorry, yeah. I'm currently the creative lead of AfrikaBurn, have been for a pretty long time. Plus doing development. I'm also one of the founders. My training is not creative arts, although I grew up in that milieu. My training is environmental science, but I've been doing this for a very long time. And it's such a lovely project to do. And actually, it's something that I'm missing tremendously in my life, is not engaging with that critical mass of beautiful projects every year. And so, yeah, I was feeling a little nostalgic when watching that video. I was like, oh, damn, I wish we could do that again. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for sharing, Monique. Lars?
Hi, I'm currently the director of Whatever Next at AfrikaBurn, because we seem to be just lurching from one thing to the next and a lot of craziness going on. My background is really in community arts, so performance, street performances, intercultural carnival, that kind of thing. And I got involved with AfrikaBurn, coming to AfrikaBurn with the carnival project that I was working with. And yeah, I mean, my particular interest is in various aspects of arts incubation. So I'm really pleased to be engaging in this session today.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you for sharing. Could I have Mr. Ralph Borland, please?
Thank you very much, Cindy, and hi everyone. I'm an artist, and my project for the last several years is called African Robots. and I work with street wire artists to make interactive electronic wire art. And I've received funding from the South African government before for that project, so I can talk about that. I've also been funded when I lived in Ireland. I was also funded by the Irish Arts Council for my community engaged artwork. And more recently, I've taken up a research post at UCT with the Institute for Humanities in Africa, looking at the role of the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Africa. So as an artist, my work combines art, science, and technology. And I'm a lot about hybridity and bridging boundaries. So I like to bring different people together in my art projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Okay, could you please have Solitude Monwabis, please?
Okay. My name is Monwabisi, also known as Solitude. My last name is Darcy. I was born in Queenstown, grew up in Stainsburg, but lived in Cape Town for most of my life. I do not hold a lot of hats except the one that I have on my head. I'm very passionate about arts and expression in general, and I guess I also am very much fascinated by a life of people being absolutely free. To be, and that's basically what I'm advocating for each and every time I try to do whatever I do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And could you please have Nathan, please?
My name is Nathan. I've been involved with art as well as community development and skill sharing for about 35 years. In some way or another, sometimes separately and sometimes combined, art and skill sharing. And I've been involved with AfrikaBurn in some kind of way since the start. And I've been involved in a number of builds. Yeah, also I'm now at the moment, for the last 5-6 years, I've been busy with a project in Sutherland where I'm using builds at AfrikaBurn to create sharing of skills and availability of tools and equipment. That's it.
Thank you, Sabonga. Thank you so much, Nathan. And then lastly, Mr. Stephen Sack, please. You may introduce yourself, and when you're ready, take us into the evening. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. I've been involved in the arts my entire working life, and I came out of the community arts sector, and in fact out of the theatre sector. I was involved in Junction Avenue Theatre Company from 1976, and then I was a teacher and an academic for a while. And I suppose what's most important for the purposes of our discussion is that from 1997, I joined what was then the Department of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology, and my portfolio was in policy development. So we developed the new policies for what was the first iteration of the cultural industries. It was called the Cultural Industries Growth Strategy, SIGS for short. And so we did the first economic studies that had ever been done in our sectors in order to equip ourselves to be able to make the case to National Treasury for financial support for the sector as a viable economic sector. You probably all know that prior to 1994, in the nationalist government, the funding environment then was there were 4 performing arts councils in the 4 provinces. There was a film tax rebate, so there was a lot of bad film being made and people getting hold of these tax rebates. And they established something called the Foundation for Creative Arts, which when it started with R1 million. It had R1 million a year to disperse to the arts. And Christopher Till headed up the Foundation for Creative Arts. I go into government in 97, and by 2000, our strategy's in place. We looked at craft, music, films, books, and publishing. Those are the 4 sectors that we looked at. And we started from then on to be in a position to make the case to National Treasury for funding. Now, in those days, from 2000 to probably around 2005-06, I actually left national government in 2004. But around 2000 to 2004, there were a whole lot of new windows for funding that we applied for. So when the skills levy was put in place, the SETAs, we made sure that we got funding for our sector for skills funding. When the poverty fund was launched, we made sure we got money for the poverty fund. We got additional funding for the creative industries. And at that time as well, what happened was government restructured the performing arts councils, took a whole lot of the money away, and put that money into the National Arts Council, which started off with about 45 million rand, and then set up the National Film and Video Foundation, which, as I recall, had about 60 million rand to start off with, the National Heritage Council. And then most importantly was the establishment of the lottery. And there again, we had to fight to make sure that with charities and with sport, that there was a section for arts and culture. And we were successful, and that has probably been the most significant fund post-94 for the sector, because it's been such large sums of money. Everybody knows that if you'd applied to the National Arts Council, you know, you'd be lucky to get 100,000 or 200,000 rand, but you could hit the jackpot. You could literally win the lottery. You could make an application to the lottery and you could get 30 million rand. And the lottery unfortunately operated, well, firstly, it's a fund that falls under the Department of Trade and Industry. And so it's not kind of able to be overseen or regulated in any way by the Department of Arts and Culture or by artists. Now, one of the big challenges that has happened in the whole art funding environment in recent times, and it's global, is that if you look at UNESCO, you know, UNESCO have these 7 domains, and I'll just remind you all of what they are. So there's cultural and natural history, performance and celebration, visual arts and crafts, books and press, audio, visual and interactive media, and design and media services. So whereas when I started in the department thinking in a very narrow sense about the arts, that all of the arts, you know, was what we understand to be music, fine art, dance, theater. What has happened is that there's this vastly expanded definition. And so if you look at a report of what the National Lottery funds, you'll find they're supporting indigenous agriculture. They're supporting a whole range of projects that we wouldn't have typically thought would have belonged within the domain of the domain of the arts. So that's one problem, that it's become this massive catch-all for all kinds of people who can apply for projects. You're probably also all aware of the current situation with the National Arts Council and the huge debacle that has happened with the funding, the COVID relief funding. And that is interesting in and of itself, because you have an agency that typically disperses 60 or 70 million rand a year, suddenly being asked to disperse 300 million rand, and the wheels come off in a really, really bad way. And I'm really worried about what the implications are for the future. The other area where I was very involved was in the development of community art centers. And we got money very early on from the RDP to build community art centers throughout South Africa. And that appeared to have been an unmitigated disaster. And the reason was because we built the infrastructure, we came in with the money from National to build the infrastructure, and there was this kind of fallacy that local authorities would provide the funding to run these art centers and would provide funding for staff, which happened very, very slowly, and a lot of the art centers never ever opened effectively. I must say the Western Cape is the exception to the rule. The Western Cape has always had a lot more effective community arts and art centers, operational art centers. And they have those, a lot of those were in existence pre-94, and then they were able to transition into a post-94 environment. So there are very different levels of development depending on which provinces you're in. And then finally, just to say, the work that I'm doing now, so over my entire working life, I've watched as particular art forms have been important and have been focused on for funding. So kind of post-76, it was theater. In the early 80s, it was dance. With the work that we did in government, the craft sector became incredibly important, and a lot of money and a lot of development was put into the craft sector. It's interesting that comedy arises and photography and all of these art forms have their time and their place where suddenly they're most significant. And it seems to me that right now, the big focus is on gaming and animation. And there's a lot of interest. And I'm involved with a small team in doing research into gaming and animation in order to try and attract international investment into that sector. With respect to AfrikaBurn, so you guys obviously fall into the space of festivals and events and kind of performance and celebration. Now that sector is funded directly by the National Department of Arts and Culture in their Mzansi Golden Economy program. And you'll see if you look at their reports that they tend to spread the money very thin and very wide. So they support dozens and dozens of events and projects. So it means that the big events, like your event, like the Grahamstown Arts Festival, etc., those major kind of events often struggle to get the kind of funding from government to make them viable. I sincerely hope that AfrikaBurn is not having to depend on government to fund them, because it's not a good place to be in if you're trying to run an organization, if you're trying to run something sustainably. Yes, get some money from government for development, but the last thing you want to do is to end up being dependent on funding from government, because it's unpredictable and unreliable. I'll stop there.
Whew, that was, I think actually you captured the essence of the research that I had done to talk about the subject. You've contextualized where we are, and you've given us insights into the future. And I absolutely applaud you for that. And thank you so much for bringing your wisdom and your experience and your knowledge to us today. I'm going
just one last thing about the future.
Yes, of course.
The key departments are busy writing a master plan for the creative industries. And so that involves the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. The Department of Small Business Development are taking the lead. The Department of Communications, the Department of Trade and Industry, they're the key departments. And they're now busy doing a new master plan for the sector. So I'm sure that will be put out into the public domain quite soon for public comment. And I could share some of the information with you if you're all interested.
I would love that actually, because when I doing my research, I found that the public arts policy was, as old as you're saying, you were saying some of it had actually been, it was based on the post-apartheid public policy, which is post-94 type of policy. And I'm glad that now you're saying that there's a master plan. Yes, please share that with us. Would love to hear that.
Want to hear something now about it or at a later?
Of course, go ahead.
Okay, well, so they work with the UNESCO domains. So they've got a strategy for each of the 7 domains. And they are, what's interesting is that at the G20 this year, for the first time in the history of the G20 meeting, culture ministers have been invited. And I think that there, as you all know, there's a sort of a significant global shift where countries are starting to mainstream the creative economy in a much more significant way than ever before. And that must be the reason why they're being invited to the G20. The master plan will be taken to this cluster of ministers. And so one of the very important things in the new strategy is what they call social compacts. So you as a sector, if your sector is live events or festivals, within that sector, you need to organize the social partners and you need to form yourselves into an industry sector in order to interact as a sector with government. And the point about these social compacts is the concept is, what do the social partners bring to the table? And what does government bring to the table? And what do international partners bring to the table? So that's a very, very important part of the way in which work is happening. The other very important aspect of it is these ideas of an inclusive economy. And because that also comes up very significantly in the new white paper. And one of the things about an inclusive economy is, how do you triangulate city, township, and village? So, what tends to happen is that if you want to be an artist, you've got to come to the city. You can't, if you need internet connection, you're not going to get that in a village or in a township. So there's this attempt to sort of work out, how do we ensure that there's a capacity to enable people in those 3 different spaces. So I would think that is part of this idea of an inclusive economy. How do you show that you've got partners in rural areas, in townships, and in the city, all networking together? So as you develop a social compact, very important that you've got partners from those different kinds of areas. And then just for the rest of it, it is really sector by sector. So each sector have identified, they've each done a SWOT analysis. So that's the other thing that you should do. You should look at what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for your sector. That is quite important. And then some of the history of the kind of the successful projects, as much data and analytics as you can provide about your sector. The biggest problem about us competing is this obsession with jobs created. It's all about jobs created. And one of the things that we always say is that in our environment, it's about work opportunities. These are not always full-time jobs. These are often part-time jobs or work opportunities. And that's what actually disables us, because when they look at the data, the first thing they look at is jobs created. And so the people in the creative economy have tended to over-exaggerate the number of jobs created, and that doesn't help us, because eventually you get caught out. That, in a nutshell, is what it's about.
Thank you so much. I think we've got a takeaway from that, and we know that there's some work that we need to do to shift ourselves into a social sector, and to be part of this inclusivity economy. So thank you so much, Stephen. So we'll move on to our questions now. And Stephen, stay with us. Everybody stay with us as we go through and I ask different questions based on what we've heard and what we're all actually going through. So my first question will then be to all my panelists. Consider this: how does AfrikaBurn's grant programs differ from other arts funding in South Africa, given now what we've heard? So I'll ask this to Lorraine and Monique. What does AfrikaBurn's grant criteria focus on and why?
That's not a small question. So I mean, I'll go through some stuff, but I think what I wanted to do was reflect a little bit on what Stephen was saying around. I mean, so around the difficulty of job creation and that kind of thing. But because AfrikaBurn has always been a bit of an outlier, it kind of defies categorization. We don't. So, for example, we don't even like to use the word festival because really, in its essence, hopefully in its best iteration, it's a social experiment. So we don't even like to necessarily use the term art. We use the word creativity because it's a very often art is an exclusionary term, and certainly the default world art world is very kind of, it can be, sorry, I don't want to be too dramatic, but it can be very like quite an in-group scenario. Whereas the function of AfrikaBurn is really a tool for people to connect with their creativity, and creativity is a route to solving a million different things, personally, in the world, collaboration, non-judgment, all these kinds of things. So so what we were saying was resonating with me because we've always inhabited this space where the essence of what AfrikaBurn is, and I just want to qualify that by saying that it's no one thing for any one person. It's a whole array of things for different people. But there's always been a discord or an unease where it meets up with the requirements of the kind of default world statutory things. And we experience that definitely when we are applying for funding because they want to know about job creation, they want to know about, and so we very often have to massage the little bits and pieces around AfrikaBurn into, you know, what the requirements are for creative or art funding. And just to be clear, you know, AfrikaBurn has been very reliant entirely on our ticket sales through the years for our creative grant pot. And we've had some outside funding from the DAC, NAC, but it's certainly the ratio is flipped towards being radically self-reliant, which we are, and which is an interesting thing. You know, it talks to global trends. It's, you know, of festival culture and that kind of stuff. But we can go into those later. So I'm not even that aware of how other grant funding works besides the ones that we have appealed to, but very much our approach to our grant funding is that we want it to be very open source because that's a principle upon which AfrikaBurn functions in a big way. We create space and we invite participants to project onto that space whatever they can and whatever they want to. So our kind of criteria have got to be quite broad and open to possibility because there's so many different ways that things can be deemed, because obviously we want to enable everything. That's our job. We create space and we enable creative projects and we enable collaboration, because very much the approach around art and creative projects at AfrikaBurn is that the end product is one thing, but the process is far more important than the end product because we're a social experiment. We don't call anything a success or a failure unless you've been trying it for at least 3 years, you know. So those kinds of things. And also, you know, we've got to engage with the transformative potential of creative projects. And yeah, and so you'll see I keep saying creative projects rather than art. I do love art, but one of our oldest and longest standing contributors, Echon Tanya, always problematizes it as a modernist term, and we are all artisans. So anyway, but so what we do when we assign a certain amount of money out of our grant pot, and it's always been a strategic goal to channel more and more money towards creative projects, because that's really where the alchemy very often happens. At AfrikaBurn, is in the shared struggle to put these sculptures up or these projects together, performance, whatever, in this harsh and difficult environment. So our kind of criteria. So what we do is when people will submit their projects for creative grant application, we then, so I'm just going to race through this because I feel like it'll take too much time from what can be nice, fertile discussion, but it's a good kind of base to understanding how we approach it. So we then put up all the projects. We have certain criteria that people have to fill in their forms and put pictures and stuff like that up. And we don't care whether it's a picture drawn on a serviette or a beautiful SketchUp drawing or CAD drawing or whatever, because the quality of your drawing doesn't necessarily kind of indicate the quality of the end, you know, of what actually actualizes out in the desert. We then invite, so we put all of that stuff up, and we put it up without any people's, it goes up anonymously, there's no names attached to it. And then we have a creative, an art committee, and we have the subcommittee of the art committee who do the creative grant assessments. So we go through it and we have a series of questions, which I'll just run through quickly now. But what the other thing that we do is that if you're applying for a creative grant, you have to come and do an assessment of other people's applications too, which kind of gives it a really lovely, everyone gets invested. It becomes a quite a fertile kind of petri dish where everyone goes, oh, that project, and I've got an idea around that project. And there's a space where people can give ideas, and then we feed those back to the artists, those of us who are doing administration. Then after we've kind of got numeric kind of assessment numbers, we kind of group them in the top, you know, and we start assessing those. And then, but that's not where it stops. It's not just a numeric process. We then start looking at the stories behind the artworks. So if an artwork hasn't scored really well in the kind of public process, we look at the story behind it. Is it a bunch of school leavers who are trying their first artwork ever? Is it a group of people that are, you know, are using only in waste products from, you know, alien clearing projects? There's a whole lot of criteria which kind of make these things worth looking at again and overriding the numbers thing. So because and you know, even if it's just someone who's doing an artwork for the first time in their life and they're bashing through that barrier, you know, giving even just a tiny amount of seed funding really helps push it beyond. And then in addition to that, we give a hell of a lot of feedback and connect them to a lot of people. But basically the questions we ask ourselves are the creative merit of the project. Do we like it? Is it innovative, experimental? Does it challenge barriers? Does it make a statement? Is it culturally significant to AfrikaBurn? Its catalytic potential, what impact will it have on AfrikaBurn gathering in the cultural landscape beyond AfrikaBurn and in general? What level of engagement or interactivity does it invite? Because interactivity is a very kind of important part of the creative works at AfrikaBurn. Is there a low barrier to participation? So for example, street parades and things like that means that anyone can come and get involved in them. And that's a very good portal for some people to be able to leap through. Then we've got, and as I'm reading these, just they don't have to fulfill all of these criteria. It can be, you know, one or two, like, and some will kind of have a really fantastic kind of element, which is, you know, not written anywhere, and we'll have discretionary points there. Legacy and idealism, this is where the kind of environmental and inclusivity issues come out. Will the project create new opportunities in its making and inventing? Does it reach out? Is there a broader social contribution? Does the project process actively seek to overcome barriers of entry to marginalized participants? Does the project leave anything behind, like infrastructure, skills development? Can it be repurposed? Will it have a life after Tankwatan? Will it generate new genres? Does the project use waste materials to make the work? Is the method of putting it together inclusive and experimental? And then in the second phase, we then actually put the names up and the histories of the various artists, and that is around the chances of success. So even if people don't have a history with AfrikaBurn, do they have some engineers and architects in the mix? So very basically, are the skills necessary to make the project happen available? Because very often people will have these huge dreams and then they aren't necessarily able to deliver them. What is the delivery of track record at AfrikaBurn? So some people may have put up an artwork, but they've left a total mess, and so then that'll bring the chance of funding down. So yeah, I think I'll stop there and let Lorraine segue from there.
Okay.
Thank you. What I also wanted to just touch on briefly, and I'll be quick because I see that time is marching on and we've got a lot to cover, is that I think where AfrikaBurn does disrupt kind of normal funding models or typical funding models is the openness of it and the fact that we do have that peer review process. And then just to mention that beyond the creative grant pot, there are, of course, other grant funding mechanisms. We have the DMV, have their mutant vehicle grants. We also have other activities that we're doing, like Streetopia. We've had legacy grants where artists have applied to put forward proposals for artworks in observatory. And that the fact that we don't have a set agenda of what we're trying to achieve. So oftentimes I think funding calls, well, there'll be a very kind of specific focus. And as Stephen mentioned earlier, like there's been kind of over time, genres have become more popular and then they've kind of fallen out of favor. So I think in terms of that aspect, we are quite disruptive to the norm because we don't say, we are looking for X, Y, and Z to fund. It is very much anything that someone wants to try and achieve. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Cindy.
So while I have you, I'm just going to shoot to question C. So why, in terms of your funding criteria, etc., and how we are interacting with artists that are coming from townships and rural areas and just general, and why is art development and art incubation relevant for AfrikaBurn?
Well, it's relevant for AfrikaBurn, the event, in terms of diversity, because AfrikaBurn is an event that's attended by a large international contingent. So it's around ensuring that we are growing African creative expression and also ensuring a diversity of expression. I mean, one of the funny things on site when we have like the international ranger contingent coming there, I was like, well, where's the African performance? Those kinds of things. So it's the fact that people are looking for that, and when they don't see a groundswell of it, there's a kind of question mark as to what are we doing about making sure that there's a greater diversity of creative content that comes from the African continent. And then I think in terms of incubation, what we're able to achieve at AfrikaBurn is very much a kind of a peer-to-peer incubation. So it's not necessarily from the organization itself to artists and creatives, but it's a kind of, it circulates around. So you might have someone like a Nathan Honey giving advice and guidance to another artist who's trying something for the first time, or on site you'll have art sluts pile in and help to build an artwork or something like that. So it really is a generative space. And I mean, we did run a few surveys about 3 or 4 years ago with the creative crews and to kind of understand what creating art at AfrikaBurn catalyzed. And it really was around new creative opportunities, new work opportunities, those kinds of things. So oftentimes that happens without organizational people needing to be involved. It's that kind of space that generates it.
Thank you. Thanks, Lars. And if I can just ask Ralph Boland and Stephen, actually, just to briefly, before we now move on to the next section, is, how can funding of the sector as a whole impact the notion of inclusive spaces? I know that, Steve, you spoke about, tapping into the township and rural economy, moving art just outside of the city, and etc. How do you think that funding of the sector as a whole will impact the notion of inclusive spaces? Do you think it'll grow, or what is your idea there? This is for Ralph Boland and Stephen. Ralph, could you please go first?
Sure. Thanks, Cindy, and thanks everyone who's spoken before. I think my response to this question will be to talk about my personal experience in that realm of like art and inclusivity, because I think that's what I have, that's the information I have to offer. So in Ireland, the funding that I received was for a collective called Tactic that a friend of mine, an Irish artist, and I started. And we applied to the Irish Arts Council for funding. They have a number of funding streams in Ireland that are specifically for art with community, so art as a means of social intervention. But what we proposed was to take up this residency space and use our funding to host events which brought other artists together, and in which we were like almost like a distribution channel for the funding to other art groups. So as artists, we took on the role of getting funding in order to give it to other artists and to spread the benefits of it, and also to bring artists together. So for example, we had an event, a debate called "You Stole My Idea," and that was to discuss the kind of artistic rivalry and jealousy and that comes up with all of us from art school onwards, where it's this notion of like, what's mine and you took it and that's my material. And so we wanted to challenge that. So we arranged a few dozen seats in a circle so that we were all like equal facing each other, and then we debated this notion. And I think it was really interesting because it brought out into the open something that artists feel and are sort of afraid of, and we had the opportunity to openly discuss it amongst ourselves. So I think that was the creation of an inclusive space using state funding. And then for my African Robots project, that's also to do with, I apply for funding. The first funding I got from the NAC was for 100,000, and I used that to employ wire artists to make designs and work on projects together. And we did an exhibition in Observatory. We did like a pop-up at one of the bars on Lower Main Road. And I think something about the opening night and that weekend that we were open is that you can see photographs of like wire artists talking to members of the public, to other artists, everyone sort of mingling and talking about the work that was being created. And I know for the wire artists talking to me about it, they say that it really reminds them of the value of what they do. A lot of them are very invested in their work, but when they're in this environment that's been created kind of for their work, and they're having an opening and they're artists at their own opening at a gallery, then they really feel that sense of status and they encounter people's interest in what they do. So I also feel like those create inclusive spaces in which you bring together people from different socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds, and you create these new opportunities. And also bringing wire artists into the Zeitz to work on the Dubship project, I also felt was including street level artisans in the biggest contemporary art museum in Africa, and having what they do taken seriously. So that's from personal experience. And just to add to that, I'm responding in my mind to some of the things Stephen said about the funding that is spread wide and thin. That was for the festival sort of channel of funding. But I'm thinking about it with this recent presidential economic stimulus program that's the source of all the unrest at the NAC offices, the mismanagement of that fund. And that was all. It sounds like some people received very large amounts, and those are some of the people who are perhaps connected there, but a lot of it was spread very thin. And Tony Lancaster, who was involved with the National Arts Festival, he wrote a Daily Maverick piece about saying, couldn't that pot of money have gone to fewer organizations that each got larger sums, and that each of them could have effectively channeled it to create more overall benefit? And it's an interesting point because, in a small way, what I'm doing when I apply for funding is I'm getting large sums, and then I work with lots of other people on the projects, and I channel that money out to other people. And on a much higher level than that, I think that's what Tony was talking about as well, was about organizations that have the capacity to use that money effectively and to actually use it for wider benefit. So it's an interesting maybe just point to consider around inclusivity, that it could mean going to fewer organizations for wider benefits rather than the other idea, which is to try and give it to as many people as possible directly. So I think that's it. Thanks.
Stephen, is there anything you want to add there before we move on?
Monique, what's interesting about your presentation is that you guys are commissioning work. And one of the biggest problems in the way everything has been set up. So the National Department has a budget of 4 billion rand. About 1 billion goes to heritage, 1 billion goes to arts and culture, 1 billion goes to libraries, and 1 billion is for them running their administration, etc. All of their institutions, the cultural institutions, there are 27 cultural institutions, none of them have budgets to commission work. I mean, obviously, the National Arts Council, National Film and Video Foundation, National Heritage Council, they commission work. But none of the theaters have money to commission new work. None of the museums have money to commission new exhibitions. They are conceived of as receiving houses. They don't produce new work. So we've actually got a really dysfunctional system, the way in which it has been set up. All of these cultural institutions, that Freedom Park, to give you an example, 90 million rand a year is spent in running Freedom Park. They have 50,000 visitors a year, if they're lucky. So there's just this, if anybody was involved in job creation, it was the Department of Arts and Culture. When I was there were 100 of us running the department. There are now 500 people running the same department. The whole thing has become so top heavy that the resources that should be available for practitioners, for makers, for creatives, is never going to be enough money. It's clear from the National Arts Council funding this last round, they got 300 million, they needed 600 million, and the truth of the matter is that they need 600 million every year, not 60 million rand. They need 10 times more money to actually be able to help develop the sector. Just last thing, the arts and culture budget is 0.25% of the national budget. So the national budget is X number of trillion. I used to know the number. And arts and culture, it's now shifted because it's sports, arts and culture. So the numbers have changed. So it's 0.25% is what we get. Now that's better than any other country on the continent of Africa. But the campaign should be that arts and culture should get 1%. That should be the campaign. Because if we got 1%, then we would be in the realm of the possible of really being able to grow a significant creative economy that would have major global impact. So I think that is the last thing I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. And then now, before we move on quickly, Solitude, usekhona bawo? Solitude.
Yes, I am here.
Thank
Present.
you.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
So some of the pains that I know that we go through as African artists, and I'm going to be frank about the industry, is that a lot of times, in order for us to participate in art projects, we either have to collaborate with an organization that's bigger, somebody who's connected through other councils, a bigger artist, and it's been like that post 94. How does it make you feel, like being an artist, a creator, and you want to create your own artwork and stuff, and every time you applying for funding, it's you put on the back burner, or you must collaborate with somebody, or you must go into the development project or program or the incubation. Well, how does it feel for you not being able to own that process and work independently with your other brothers and sisters in the industry?
I guess also I find my answers within what you just said last, being that as an artist who comes from my background, I guess I wouldn't necessarily even call myself an artist, but basically what I'm trying to get to is that for someone who comes from the township or the village, going into spaces, the first stumbling block that we get to deal with is articulation. First, to be able to articulate things that we have, especially, I know a lot of other people other than myself, because I've never been taught in any institution what to do. I don't have any document that proves that I have these qualities, but I've actually explored my natural talents. And part of which I've had experiences where I was painting a mural with an artist who was undergone, university teaching, and I hadn't done it. And she actually ended up not doing the painting anymore because she didn't like the way I was doing these things, because it wasn't making, it was not the way she was taught. And I guess then the battle, what I'm trying to highlight by that is that then you come into spaces where your background, which is all mostly informed by having to pull through very, heavy layers that are put there to put you where you are, or to keep you there. And you having to then maneuver your way up in order to realize your full potential. So that has definitely been a very, very big challenge, and it still proves to be. And as a result, with my experience so far with arts, I haven't been that involved for long. I would say I'm as old as 7 years now in visual arts. And within that space and time, I've struggled with being in places where people wouldn't trust my abilities to do what I'm saying that I can do, because I don't have documents and things that prove that I actually am capable. And sometimes having to do, like, I ended up decorating the embassy of Thailand once without any of those, but a lower scale project didn't give me the job because they didn't trust my capabilities. So there's a whole lot of other things that play into making things twice as challenging for people who come from a background like mine, trying to get into spaces. There's also, I guess, not being able to understand the language that's spoken up there. And I'm not meaning in terms of English, but I mean in terms of how to communicate, in terms of being able to get the funding, what are the right things to say, and all, without just thinking about what idea you want to do. And actually, I found myself frustrated about a month ago when I was talking to my colleagues when we were busy working on sculptures in Napier, that there's certain people whose dreams just come true immediately when they want them to, or when this, and it takes twice as much for it to happen. Like, for an example, I was making an example with my Boiki project that I had dreamt of having it happen, and there's been so many chances that it could happen, and I guess I would have been very happy to have to use that as one of the references of what I've done at AfrikaBurn, and to call myself an artist within that space. But that only thing that hasn't happened up till today, due to the fact that last year there was COVID, and And I was lucky enough, I guess, that we got all the funding that we asked for, but then we couldn't have it anymore. And it just meant that that whole idea wasn't happening. But then the support that one has received within the very same AfrikaBurn space has actually kept that hope a little bit alive, even though it's still amongst the whole lot of challenges, one of which is what I've highlighted, that there's not a lot of sources of funding that that can support projects that don't necessarily have a very strong backing that says that these people have an experience having done this and that and that. So I guess it's also now what makes AfrikaBurn a unique case is that now they are willing to actually help or facilitate a process of making that dream a reality. I don't know if I answer your question, but I feel like I'm mumbling a lot.
Thank you so much. Monique, you have your hand up before we move to the, and I'm taking questions now. So Monique, you're my first question for this section.
No, it's just a comment. That's a very thoughtful and beautifully said thing that you said there, Solitude. Thank you. And those kind of narratives around what gets funding and having the language to say it is such a barrier, you know, that cannot be ignored, which is why when we do in creative grants, we, you know, there's a patch of time where Issa will reach out to people and go, do you need me to sit with you and help you write and do this thing? You know, like we have patches of time where we will actually write those and enter those kinds of details. But actually what I wanted to say was it was interesting. It just made me think about Thomas Steiner's story, who's been volunteering on a lot of artworks just from the sheer kind of enthusiasm for the projects at AfrikaBurn. He's a Swiss national. And due to the fact that he's volunteered on all these projects at AfrikaBurn, because he does lighting, he's a very techie kind of guy. And so now during COVID relief time, he could apply to the Swiss government for support as an artist, because he could actually put all of those projects that he's volunteered on at AfrikaBurn and he's been supported fully by the government as an artist who cannot work at this time. So it's interesting.
Thanks, Monique. All right, so we are moving to question 2 to section 2 now. All right, so AfrikaBurn as an incubator now. Monique, you can stay on, and Nathan, how can AfrikaBurn's human scaffolding promote a level playing field? Monique, and then Nathan could also chip in here.
I'm going to speak for a short while because I've been speaking a lot, I think, but the scaffolding, I mean, I'm assuming that this is the kind of the AfrikaBurn, the functions that we do at AfrikaBurn, it's the human scaffolding, like, because actually everyone who works at AfrikaBurn, our job is plainly to enable and to facilitate. As we create space, we must also just facilitate whatever it is that comes up for people in whatever way we can. And that's not babying them or mollycoddling them. Sometimes you get those that kind of need that. But you know, we've had a very interesting array of cases. But on a bigger, just in terms of a bigger question in the world, and is the words level playing field are quite challenging in the South African context particularly. So I just want to make that qualification that we can think that we have all of these mechanisms to try and attempt to level the playing field, and we're trying really hard. And I think that something such as AfrikaBurn that positions itself as an idealistic pursuit in its best iteration cannot not deal and look very deeply at those things, those barriers to entry, those kinds of things that make the playing field completely unlevel. So yeah, I wish we could do more, but the human scaffolding, very briefly, and I'm just going to run through it, is our art committee, our volunteer engineers, our groups called Art Sluts, the way that we connect people, the other artists supporting other artists. Well, actually, they don't even need to be artists, they're builders, they're all sorts of kind of permutations of humans, but it really is just around creating community. And and a community that collaborates, and creativity where you have a lot of different inputs is really good creativity. And over to you, Nathan.
Yes, as Monique said, the playing fields will never be altogether level. And I think that at one level, people that previously were had no opportunity, there would be absolutely no ways that they could take part in building something in AfrikaBurn, are getting that opportunity. And that definitely is a good aspect of support. And I've seen it, but the other thing is, over the years, I've seen as a supporter of AfrikaBurn in terms of material and equipment that they do make available for people wanting to do projects there. As they've increased that, the expectations have also increased. Where people are taking less responsibility for what they need to be able to do something there. Even people are coming up without material or tools or anything and expecting that everything will be given to them. So I think it's very important how one handles that whole situation. But I think that definitely in terms of support and encouragement and putting people in contact with other people who maybe have the skills or have the equipment, have the experience, I think definitely what is getting more people who previously would not be able to take part. Not some people, because financially they couldn't afford it. Some people because they just couldn't conceptualize, they couldn't think of themselves of doing something. So it's anybody. Accountants are realizing that they can do creative projects, and people in poverty are also realizing it coming to. So I do think it's opening the gates to the sports field, but it definitely isn't there. Playing fields yet. But it is starting to go some way direction. Do you want me to say more?
No. I'm going to actually just stay there, and then I'm going to ask a question to you and Solitude. What are the benefits of being able to fail in a space of non-judgment? Like, and I hate the word fail. Because I think in creativity, there's no failure. When I was taught art, there was no wrong line. You just have to, keep going until you create a form that you're most comfortable with. But what are the benefits of being able to fail in a space of non-judgment, or to say, okay, I conceptualized something this way, it came out this way, but I can keep going? How does it really, like, what are the benefits of being able to fail in a space of non-judgment?
Yes, and you mentioned the problems with the word fail, just as we previously talked about problems with the word art. I mean, we all talk about art as if we know what it is. And somebody would show me something and say, "Oh, isn't that beautiful?" I said, "I'll say that's not art." And I don't even know what I mean when I say it's not art. I don't know what art is. I don't know when something goes from one thing. I don't know what the other things are. So we don't know what art is really. And whatever art is, I don't think it's something I can fail at. So I think that a rephrasing of that, instead of not saying it's okay to fail, I think what AfrikaBurn is doing is they're giving a space to experiment. And so people are coming and experimenting with certain stuff, visually as well as structurally. They are experimenting, and one can't really fail in an experiment. You're testing something, and things could work out differently to what you thought they would, what was expected. But creating that environment where you can experiment, and it will be okay if your experiment, the results are different to what you thought it were going to be. I think creating that kind of space is a very liberating space for anybody that wants to create something.
Thanks, Nathan. No, Monwabisi, what do you feel about such a notion of being, sort of free to experiment in a space of non-judgment? You're on mute. Please unmute.
No, what my question was, in terms of the space, then is that you're speaking in the context of AfrikaBurn, or you mean generally?
You can generalize it, and you can relate to AfrikaBurn. You could do both or the one, either or.
I was gonna say that I don't recall seeing such a space anywhere, whether within AfrikaBurn or outside.
Yeah.
Because I guess, I mean, but when I would then speak in the case of AfrikaBurn is the benefits of failing. I guess fail wouldn't exist in the way in which I've grown to understand AfrikaBurn, and the way in which I was introduced to what is happening there. So with that said, I would like to take a few minutes just trying to explain what I mean. And say that when I came into AfrikaBurn, which was in 2018, not so long ago, I came to just do volunteering, and I didn't even know what it was all about. But what then I was exposed to gave me enough, because the impression I was given was that, no, it's just boobs and drugs. And when I went, I then got to see the alternative lifestyle. That's something that I would like to take beyond just that space, even though there's a saying that you should leave no trace. And I was like, this is something that I actually would love to rub onto other people, because it's also very hard to explain to someone who hasn't been there. And then in terms of inclusivity, it then becomes a little bit of a challenge, because one, I would sell this idea to a friend of mine, and it already has been not so fully comfortable that we have to fight your way into being welcomed or trusted in a space, which then kind of hinders the inclusivity of it, that you come and becomes in some way criminally challenged because of how you look. And maybe sometimes when things go missing, you're the first suspect or something of that sort. So with that, then makes it very, very tricky to then see that ground being level for playing, because even the people that I've seen come there are mostly what I would then call, during my activism days, rented crowd, which is just people that are brought in to make numbers. But then what I would then love to see is the space being open and roles rotating more and more, and people not being intimidated by new faces, you know, and allowing the space to be what it should be, because the idea is there. And it's just sometimes the rigidity that comes with people wanting to own things. And I guess that's basically what is in the way of inclusivity and the level playing field in the context of AfrikaBurn.
Thank you. Perfect. Monique, I see your hands up.
And only if you're taking additions.
I am taking additions because we're moving on to the next section.
Okay, I just wanted to talk about the idea of the default world idea of failure, and I wanted to say that those are very often the most transformative moments at AfrikaBurn, is where a piece is falling down. 2012 was just such a brilliant example of that, because we had this raging storm come through, and I mean, and that's where the kind of alchemy happens, is where everyone pulls in and starts pulling that dragon back up. You know, someone brings their like Land Rover and starts moving it on. I mean, Nathan also knows this. You know, I think pulling up the Clan one year, there were like 3 vehicles that were daisy chaining, pulling up an artwork, and then the one became airborne, and that's where the kind of, that's where the alchemy does happen. That's where the kind of connective tissue is built, is through shared hardship. And so it's so important to kind of, and to engage with that aspect of us not being a production. That, I mean, you know, in a short sentence, you can call it performance art, but you can, but it's such a key moment. Where, and like, so for example, there was a project that happened in Johannesburg, well, actually, which didn't happen because it just, you know, the project was just not getting up, and they were like, oh, well, we're not going to put it up anymore. And some old seasoned burners, including, I think, Monwa and Nathan kind of were like, that's not what happens at AfrikaBurn, and everyone went and just kind of jumped in and started putting it together, and it completely turned these people's burn around, you know. And so those are really important moments.
Thank you so much, Monique, for that. Yeah, and you know, I'm certainly taking notes, because part of what I do with AfrikaBurn is arts development and incubation, and I think we all kind of take on incubation and development and inclusivity in one form or fashion. And so I'm really taking notes because I do a lot of work within the NATI program and so forth, where I am doing a lot of not outreach, but like I am out there, you know, talking about AfrikaBurn and sharing that experience through visual medium in the townships. I hope to go to the rural areas as well, schools and so forth, just to get people to understand, to see what the possibilities are when you can take a movement and a project in a community of people and create amazing you know, pieces of work that inspire everybody around them. So moving on to the next session. So this one is for Stephen Sack, if he's still around. Not paying artists, so just for everybody, but I'm gonna direct my question here. But this section is about not paying artists versus paying artists, where the line's drawn and why. Okay, if we can all think about that in our heads, because when we were, you know, trying to put on like home burn and trying to put on different programs that we run, or projects, or, you know, like Streetopia or whatever, I've often been challenged by artists like, yeah, but we get paid. Like, or some people say, well, I'm an African artist, I'm already marginalized, I need something to get me by. And why does AfrikaBurn not pay artists? And so that sometimes is out there, like, you guys are exploiting artists, which is not the case, because we are an NGO, we are a community-based organization. So I want you guys to start thinking about that as I ask you each questions, some of the next questions that are coming up. Not paying artists versus paying artists, where the line's drawn and why. And the audience and anybody else who's listening there can pose a question as well. But the first question then is to Stephen Sack. The challenges within an unregulated sector, how accountable are we to government policy?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about all the research that has been done into the creative economy is just how middle class people are in the creative sector. And that's globally. So, and it's been interesting, this research that we've just been doing now on gaming and animation. We're asking people, we're trying to drill that down and find out, where do people come from? What is their family background? What did their parents do? What is the nature of their lives? And it's, you know, we often focus on the racial dimension of it, but the truth of the matter is that it's a class phenomenon as well. Yes. And that if you don't come out of a middle class family where you have networks and support structures to enable you to work creatively, it can be extremely challenging. And so in this process of democratizing the arts and expanding the arts and campaigns around arts for all, those kinds of notions, what ends up happening is, and it's become absolutely clear now, with artists being in so much difficulty and so much trouble, that if you aren't in a family with other support structures, if you aren't in a dual income family, if you yourself don't have dual income and other ways of sustaining yourselves, then you're extremely vulnerable. Because one of the other interesting things that I picked up in the research is that when the economy is in a recession, artists are at the head, at the front of the recession. Artists suffer far worse than anybody else. When the economy is growing, the arts grow ahead of the curve. So when you're in a growth environment, people have disposable income, and hence they will go to the theatre and they will go to concerts and they will go to AfrikaBurn. But when you're in a recessionary environment, then people instantly hold back on, they no longer have the disposable income. So I think that the issue about how artists, there's no regulation, really. You know, I mean, if you're being employed by the SA, even in the SABC, you know, there were problems with regulation. But even if you have to understand your own capability and your own resources. When I started off in my 20s making art, we did it all ourselves with no money. We were at university, but we came from middle-class families, you know, and our first collaboration with Black actors, with Workshop 71, for those Black actors, we had to become commercially viable very fast. And we were lucky. We did a play called Sophia Town, and it made money, and actors earned money. But, you know, we were fine with making plays that didn't really sustain us because we had other jobs. So I think this issue of multiple livelihoods is absolutely critical. And I think that when we look at the curricula, I mean, I get really worried when people go and study just art and only art, thinking that they're going to be able to sustain themselves and live off that for the rest of their lives. If they're not also doing teacher training, or if they're not also doing some other kind of, getting other kinds of qualifications, because the reality is that a very, very tiny percentage of artists are going to sustain themselves. So if for you as an artist, doing a gig and being involved in something and not being paid is to your advantage, then do it. You know, there are other ways in which you're going to get benefits. But if you've got to put food on the table, then you're not in a position to volunteer. But there's no law or regulation that's going to help you solve that problem.
Thanks, Stephen. That's brilliant. And that is true. And so then that question is, that helps us to look at what we mean when we say you're in a volunteer community, that this is not going to pay you, but it certainly is something that you can get involved in if you can. And it is unfortunate that a lot of people coming from various backgrounds who wouldn't be able to participate and volunteer because they simply don't have the means. All right. So, Monique, why does AfrikaBurn not pay artists to create for the week-long event?
Sure. Look, I mean, to start off with, I have a constant discomfort with that question, not because I feel like I'm being bashed or anything, but because I've experienced a million times how hard costs are easy to pay for, and the gift of art, etc., just doesn't, you know, even, you know, so for example, in the early days we absolutely tried to get, you know, medics gifted to AfrikaBurn and, you know, all those kinds of things. And it just doesn't happen. But the art is as essential a service to our community. I mean, it's foundational. It's absolutely fundamentally important. As you know, otherwise we'd be having we'd be having a beer fest in the desert. So just to start off with, is it something that I grapple with all the time? The answer is for me in terms of like the evolution of AfrikaBurn and also the kind of genesis of it and also in its design, so to speak, is the gifting principle, is that everything in AfrikaBurn should be a gift. And that is where the whole, you know, when the Burns were not designed, but when they kind of evolved no one sat down and went, okay, we're going to have a event and it's going to open people's hearts and they're going to access their creativity and it's going to be a lovely blank canvas with beautiful artworks and blah, blah, blah. That didn't happen. It was a product of the place that had happened in San Francisco, counterculture people questioning what was happening in the world, and San Francisco also being a hotbed of kind of a lot of creative activity. You know, this is where the hippies were, the bohemians, the cacophony society, and it came from the bottom up. And one of the key aspects of that was the gifting part, and the gifting and the decommodification, which is, so in to a degree, the Burns evolved as a response to our hyper transactional society that we live in, and you can just become very kind of passively consumptive, and the Burn should be the opposite of that. However, things happen, such as, and we experienced that, I particularly experienced that, I know Robert did, and various people, is that as the Burn evolved and you're spending 100% of your time working on it and you don't have the ability to take care of your life and pay your rent and your medical and your food, etc., is that then there was a very, very hard discussion that we had, and it was a lot of back and forth and a lot of fighting and a lot of kind of like, well, let's just shut it down if it's not going to work as a volunteer organization. But then we elected to pay those who were spending all of that time. And so that is what we call the human scaffolding. However, the actual event is supposed to be that thing. And that is also why we decided to register as a not-for-profit company, is because it's really important that if there is a surplus, it gets spent in the correct way. And very often that is, our idea is to channel more funding towards creative projects, always, and outreach projects, anything that grows community. So I mean, the absolute truth is that we don't always not pay artists. But basically every creative contribution to AfrikaBurn is a gift from the community, whether it's a large scale art project, whether it's a tray of cookies, whether it's that you will go and sing to someone gently while they're having a bad trip, whatever it is, whatever you do, and it's a gift. And so currently in our art grant policy, which we actually haven't reviewed for a couple of years, and it's been on one of our strategic goals, is to have a really deep and incisive kind of interrogation of that aspect of it, and in what cases. So in the past, what we've done is we've had co-funding models where the aspect that AfrikaBurn pays then pays for the materials for the artwork, and funding from elsewhere. So for example, the Cape Town Carnival will pay the living expenses of the artist, especially, so and like I said earlier, is that we are very into the human story, like we want to know the stories behind, and we have been, especially in the last kind of 5 years, really engaging deeply with what the barriers to participation and entry into this community are. Yeah, so I'm just thinking if I've missed anything else. I suppose then there's a comment around, which I started with, is around the difference, but you know, Nathan was also saying is that everyone assumes that they know what art is, and the irony is that when people were artisans, I was a painter, I was a sculptor, it was easy to pay them. Now, because there's this idea of high art, it's not easy to pay them, because there's this other notion grew out of somewhere, and I feel like there is some academic writing on it, which I'd love to kind of sink my teeth into, around how that accident in history happened. But, you know, so for example, we will pay copywriters, but we don't pay the people who design the gate handouts or the map or whatever. You know, the designers are volunteering their time. I mean, you know, now when we're in kind of severe financial distress, we are moving back towards kind of just going like, we just can't pay, and if you're going to be doing a service for AfrikaBurn, it's going to be for free. So you are getting more kind of coordinators and people who are doing more the kind of you know, the nuts and bolts stuff. And okay, I think that's enough. But yeah.
Yes, thanks. Nathan, do you want to, was something you wanted to add there before I take Suzette's question? You're on mute.
It's a little bit to add maybe about the funding, but
Yes.
yeah. And I just, strangely enough, I would disapprove of paying artists at AfrikaBurn. I think AfrikaBurn would be a very different place if artists were paid. Firstly, the whole experimenting thing would become invalid. If you pay somebody, it's not like you. If you pay the medic, he's got to be able to perform. Where the medic's got to perform. So paid art. Well, that's all the kind of the situation of experimentation will become much more strained, because the people getting paid, they've got to deliver what they say they're going to deliver, and the people have got more freedom. And I think that what artists get at AfrikaBurn, they don't get money, but they get a space and a gallery, an opportunity that is like unparalleled anywhere else. It's an enormous space for experimenting and for creating limitless. What you can do there is without limits, and I think that is much more value than getting paid. And secondly, you never actually be able to compensate financially for what people go through building something that's kind of unaffordable.
Thanks, Nathan. Suzette?
Sorry, Cindy, I just remembered a couple of other points that I did want to make around that.
Yes.
So I mean, Nathan, I wasn't trying to say, yes, I wish we could pay, but I just, that's a bigger narrative. I wish artists were paid more readily and more easily. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that AfrikaBurn is not a production. It's still an experiment. And so we don't go, okay, well, we want a lovely big thing here and a lovely big thing there, and We have to be totally committed to that whatever pops up, you know, and yes, so for example, one of the things that Artcom do and a lot of other people do is poke people in their creative ribs. They go, hey, have you ever thought of doing a thing there? Have you ever thought of it? And that's just a human relational thing. Yeah, so I just wanted to point out that it's not a production, and we have to commit to it being the experiment that it is.
Thank you. Suzette, I believe you have a question or something to add.
Hi, guys. I don't like talking, so I'm just going to be quick. It's not a question. I just like, about what Nathan said, about like paying artists and stuff. I don't think the community that I live in, people aren't creative, and they wonder why their lives are so mundane and boring and they don't get fulfilled. But it's really, people need to realize that they have to start being creative. And if you get paid, even if it's like, even like my mom started like with coloring books and that kind of stuff, you know, small stuff like that. And yeah, I just thought like to get all the communities like just thinking about being creative, even because people aren't even thinking about it. They just saying like, no, life is crap, and you know, they're not doing anything about it. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Suzette. All right, before I move, so I'm moving over to a question for Lorraine here. So can you tell us if ever there are situations where AfrikaBurn does pay artists with donor money, or pay artists to enable them in any kind of way? Can you tell us a little bit about those situations?
Yeah, I mean, we do when we apply for external funding, and we have done through entities like the National Lottery and the National Arts Council and Department of Arts and Culture, when it was still just arts and culture and not had sport added to it. We do. And I mean, obviously it's something that rubs up against us, because then we are subject to a specific agenda or criteria which we are applying to. And as Monique said earlier, we have to try and kind of like find that sweet spot between the idea of an experiment and being able to not use the word fail, but be able to experiment and not necessarily achieve a predetermined outcome. And unfortunately, a lot of times with funding, and I understand why, is because people want their bang for buck and they have their idea about what they want to change in the world. But oftentimes, when you are crafting proposals, you're expected to have a predetermined outcome and outputs and those kinds of things. So what we try and do is we try and be that middle ground. We try and hold the space where artists can still create an experiment and bring what they want to bring, and we kind of scaffold that as a kind of a middle ground. So for example, we did a tour around the Northern Cape, and we did 5 or 6 different iterations of a tour, and we reached out to various kind of like community hubs, art centers, those kinds of places, and basically said, if you could have a collaboration with artists, if you could co-create something, what would you want to do? And then we would look at kind of like what budgets are available and say, okay, so we can afford to do this, we can offer you that, etc., etc. So we try not to box people into predetermined outcomes, and when those opportunities become available, absolutely we would channel money towards people's living costs and their general expenses. So I think unfortunately with external funding as well is there's never enough money for artists. I mean, Stephen said it earlier, there's never enough. You put a budget together, you make an application, you get a percentage of what you actually ask for, and it's always the artist that comes off the worst in the mix, because the materials or the transport is always a fixed cost, and then the artist is the one that isn't, and so is the one that gets kind of hammered down into the what's left kind of thing. But so yeah, I mean, we've been quite lucky in the last while that we've managed to secure funding that we have been able to channel through to artists. When we did the AfrikaBurn project, we had funding that a substantial percentage of that money was required to go directly into artists' pockets. So we are able to channel that. And I think it's very important, especially in COVID times, because it's become a lot clearer how unequal we are and how COVID has affected people much more drastically. So it's incredibly important to try and meet people where they're at in all respects. So not just economically, but their ability to create things, their ability for resources, things like data. The costs of data have become such a big thing, having to put people on Zoom and have meetings on Zoom or Google Meet, and like realizing that people can't afford to join those meetings and engage in those sessions because they just can't afford the data to participate. So it's around those kinds of things and meeting people where they're at. And one of the things that I did see a while ago, which I thought was a really elegant mechanism that I thought that we could look at in terms of the way that AfrikaBurn funds and the way that AfrikaBurn funds creative projects for the event, is that the British Council have a additional percentage that you can apply for, you can add onto your grant if you have a disability, because obviously your costs are going to escalate. So I was thinking around how we could work that in, and it's not necessarily just linked to disability or ability, but linked to marginalizations. And so I apply for 30,000 rands to do whatever at AfrikaBurn, and 10 or 15% is added onto that because I don't have that social capital. I'm not middle class. I don't have those networks. I don't have a second income coming into my home during the time that I need to create. So yeah, I think, as I say, we do support artists, and it's very kind of in an ad hoc way because it's always linked to what external funding we've got coming in. But I think we can switch that up in the future. I think when we have the opportunity to fund again, and when we are able to generate our income, that we can look at those different types of mechanisms and make it slightly more cohesive than it has been in recent times.
Thanks so much, Lorraine, for that understanding. I hope that everybody got an opportunity to learn from that, from this experience. We are at the end of our session, but I'd like to open the floor to those that have raised hands, and I'd like to read some of the comments that have come through from people out there. And I believe that before I move on to Ralph, Monique, there was a question that was posed to you. Would you like to answer that?
sure. From solitude. You were asking experimental to achieve what in the end? So this is probably going to be a bit of a meandery kind of response, but one of the things about AfrikaBurn that is, and I'm not sure if I'm communicating it properly, but one of the things is that we actually can't have an end point in sight. Like, this is a bit like around the funding thing, is like, what's the end product? And so it's what Nathan was saying is that the thing about an experiment is that you're not quite sure what the end product is going to be. So, and so when I say that about AfrikaBurn, and it's interesting because kind of having done this for so many years, you experience all sorts of different responses to the thing. For some people, it's an absolutely phenomenal, experience of art or pushing their boundaries or whatever. Some, it's just a jewel in the desert, and we can't get too involved in that. We've got to do space creation, and we create a little bit of a holding pattern around that. But it has been interesting in the context of global trends that have started happening, how we've had to respond to that. So theoretically, it's a super light touch. It's, open to interpretation. The experiment, I mean, in terms of what I see and I witness and what my involvement in starting the burn was around its catalytic and transformative potential. But for that to happen, it's got to remain fairly pure to a degree, not trying to hark back to the old days, but in what it is. So one of the global trends that I'm going to describe is, for example, the growth of festival culture as a hugely popular kind of thing. And so, for example, the London Times put us on their #1 list of top things to do, bucket list items, and we were like, Jesus, please take us down. We do not want to be on anyone's like empty-headed bucket list. This is something that should be a really kind of full experience. It's not just something that you go to. And that's that. At the same time, that was when a lot of plug and play camps started coming up at AfrikaBurn, and we had to, and so it's a very interesting experience to be wrangling this thing that has its taproot in anarchy, which is no one went top down and said, we're going to organize an event that opens your heart. It was, I think I spoke about this earlier, it was just this rise of kind of countercultural thinking and playful trickster kind of thinking. So our challenge as custodians of the basket that kind of holds this loosely defined amorphous creature is to be able to give it the flexibility that it needs, but to not allow the dominant narratives, the default world kind of grid network, i.e. service delivery, i.e. I mean, there's loads and loads of different ways that we can start losing the movement. There was a writer called Richard Raw who talks about how movements will go from man to movement, to mantra, to museum, and then monument. If you don't take care of those elements which keep it alive and kind of like a generative space, there is the risk that it becomes a monument. Like it's too, so for example, one of the big things that we are, like AfrikaBurn changing the inclusivity principle, which in essence is the same, but in this day and age, you cannot, absolutely not, think of yourself as anything worth its metal if you're not engaging really, really deeply with the issues of inclusivity and transformation. No one can be passive about that, as well as the environmental imperatives. And so, the land project is that, and then I'll kind of, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's key for me, the key is that we can't try and define what the end point is. But I do know that the event in its various mechanisms, the hardship, the beauty, the is a portal through which people leap, and it very often is transformative. So whatever we need to do to keep it transformative. So you could argue, and I have argued this a lot when we were putting in our plug and play policy and literally taking measures like banning people, because we're like, you cannot sell a warm shower and cooked meals and da-da-da. It's because you're robbing people of part of the experience if you're providing those kinds of services. So yeah, I don't know if I made that clear enough.
I think so. Rolf, I believe you had something before I read some of the comments and things that.
Yeah. I'll try not to take too much time, but the subject of artists getting paid is something that's very close to my heart. And so I wanted to just say, while I understand that AfrikaBurn is a special case, you know, the event, and I've been a funded artist before, but as far as I remember, you know, I used the funds for materials and the bucky hire and to pay a welder and so on. So it wasn't money to me. But so I understand AfrikaBurn is special, but it also unfortunately overlaps with other attitudes in society towards artists, which is to undervalue the work that artists do, because it's just a very frequent thing that corporations or foundations that do have money to pay artists don't, because they think they can get away with not paying artists, you know, and they don't see it as something, they don't recognize it as something they should pay for like a professional service. And I've, you know, people sometimes think that artists are very lucky to be, you know, free and flexible. And I think that is a real benefit of being a self-employed artist some of the time. But it also comes with a great deal of stress and insecurity because you don't have a regular income and you're always looking for where your next money is going to come from. I think that, you know, often the first thing that gets cut in funding programs is the payment to artists. You know, I've been involved in funding schemes where the next year it comes around, they add the line, none of this can go to fees. You know, it all has to go to costs. And you go like, well, how can you produce something without getting paid? You know, so I feel like I'm the car, I need petrol to go in the car, and then I'm going to run, you know, I'm going to drive, because in some ways the artist is the person who really should get the money, because if the artist is really motivated and skilled, they will magnify the effect of that money, you know, far more than any other route. So I often think that actually the focus should be on funding the artist if that artist has the specific skill sets and motivation to do art that includes others, because you can take an artist whose work is solely self-involved, and, you know, that's fine in its own context. But if you're looking for art that's about including others or responding to space, then you can look for artists who that's what their practice is and that's what their skill set is. So I think it's important to also look at the individual and the context and what their motivations are. Thanks.
Thanks, Rolf. That's completely spot on. Thank you. Monique, I believe you have a point there before we wrap up. We have about 15 minutes before we have to go.
I just wanted to segue from what Rolf was saying, is that we have had the scenario in recent times, and I think this is one of the global trends that I was talking that is fairly challenging, is that people see how mediagenic and, you know, fantastic a burn is, and they go and they pick and choose their principles. So that's not a good model, you know. So things will, you know, the event, they want the event to look like AfrikaBurn. And then they also, in fact, contact us and they're like, will you give us, you know, all your artists' numbers, because they think that they are just happy to come and give art for free, you know. And so it's quite challenging in terms of that. I mean, we get quite kind of protective. But the other good thing, which Nathan was talking about, is that you get this platform, the kind of mediagenic kind of aspect of the burn, you know, the stuff that lives on in the world, the pictures, the images, that kind of thing, is that we very often become a front desk for people who are looking, they'll phone and they'll go, or email and go, who's the person who did that thing? And then we'll put them in contact with them, and it usually is a paying gig. So that is a good thing.
Thank you, Robert, and then Lorraine.
Yeah, it's sure. The role of the artist at AfrikaBurn is quite a complex thing. For me, what has always been very important is that AfrikaBurn gives some kind of platform to the creative person, whatever they do, and that helps to heighten and increase their exposure, the way they are stimulated, etc. And I find that very important. So maybe they're not being paid, but the exposure that they get is massive. I can tell many stories of artists who've created something, spent huge amounts of money, got pretty much fuck all from us, and we probably exploited them, etc. But they then, next thing, got a job building a big set for a movie company where they were paid shitloads of money. And some of those people have gone on to becoming big set builders. Danny Popper, for example, is a good example. He's now traveling the world, from making a sort of monkey puppet on his back. And he's now creating giant, massive sculptures. I mean, he's busy building permanent sculptures in the Arboretum, I think in Chicago. That's worth tens and tens of millions of dollars. And all of that out of just being part of this process. And I think that's also one of the things that the burner culture is about, is you come, you play, you experiment, and from that it's not a step up. I mean, that's a rude thing to say, but it gives you a platform and a place to play, and other people see you and go, wow, you're special, you're great, come play with me and I've got money. So that's, I think, where the burner culture is so powerful, is like that thing of, come play with me, we play together, I've got money, you've got the talent, and wada. And that's the beauty, I think, of it. And it fits in with gifting, and it fits in with all of those things. So and that's one of the things that I love about being part of the Department of Mutant Vehicles, is we have a very small budget, but we use it extremely creatively and create like a dynamic, and make it sexy and make it cool to like be part of this project. And people then build these amazing mutant vehicles just by collaborating and building community. And that's thank you.
Thank you so
Cool.
much for Lorraine, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to make it quick because Robert used the word exposure, and echoing back to Ralph, what he said about undervaluing artists and underpaying artists, is when I used to run a theatre company, I would always say to potential donors that our actors will die of exposure at the rates that they're getting paid. But there's a comment here from Angela, our McPherson one, and I wondered if she wanted to ask this question or raise it.
I was going to read that out, but I could give Angela an opportunity. I'll just read what Stephen too just said. For every artist with a story that made them super famous from exposure, you'll have 100 artists who didn't. The root of the discussion here isn't about whether everyone should be paid, but rather whether some people who are previously and largely underprivileged should be considered for getting paid. And the discussion, I don't know if Angela is comfortable to speak, but she says, if AfrikaBurn claims it's not art, but all creativity, then surely all creativity involved in all experimental work, including the technicians and experimental production, should be treated equally, and the payment of people will be treated equally across the board. Surely Nathan's point applies to all experimental activities and all areas of creativity. And then Stephen responded to say, I think the thinking of treating people equally completely ignores that they have not grown up and come from equal backgrounds. True equality of outcome requires equity in treatment of people. We have to be kind to people who have lacked many privileges that others have had. Angela, is there anything that you'd like to add there?
I would say, I would first of all wonder whether Stephen was responding to my comment. I somehow don't think he was, because I agree with him that treating people, you know, one of the phrases, one of the sayings that I hear is, that I've heard before, is there's nothing as unequal as equality. And I think what he's implying in his statement is that you can't actually say that you can treat people equally because we are not coming from equal backgrounds. But really my comment was just a challenge, was to say, you know, everybody involved in the AfrikaBurn structure is actually a creative, and all activities, as Monique was saying, in fact, the whole organization is an experiment. So, you know, holding that principle and really giving that life then immediately challenges the fact that an organization has decided to pay some of the creatives and not pay the others. I mean, look, I realize it's very complicated, but I just feel impelled to challenge that point, because then we can't say that everything is creative. That, you know, if it's all experimental and creative, then really the things that apply to artists apply to everybody in the organization, and the same things apply that Nathan was saying, is that people get given an opportunity to really use their creativity, to show themselves, to show their innovation. And so I suppose I'm just challenging you guys on that front.
Thank you. So I think Rolf would like to respond briefly. We only have 4 minutes left before we need to sign off. Rolf?
I think Angela's point has quite a lot to do with the definition of art, and that's something that's been lurking in there that you know, and what Monique said and other people have said. So, I mean, from my perspective, art is both something that's universal and accessible to everyone, and something that people practice every day. And it's also a professional practice as well. You know, that's the thing about art, is that it's one word which has a huge variety of meanings according to context. So where I'd be coming from is to say art is also a professional skill, like being a medic or an architect or a builder. So in that sense, you should pay for art. Not saying necessarily for AfrikaBurn, but in general, you pay someone to fix your car or to operate on you. You should pay an artist for their skills, which they apply. But because of the very wide meanings of what art is, and you're talking about it being about general creativity, and art falls within that. But there's a kind of, there's a tension in that, because some of the structures and the artworks that are at AfrikaBurn, they've required professional artists in order to achieve that. And there is training and experience that goes into those kinds of artworks. So yeah, that's just my addition to that debate.
Monique, I've got something to say. I think if each of my panelists could give me, I think Rolf has just said something. Monique, you may say something shortly. And then I'll ask Stephen also just to say something shortly before we just say goodbye, because he's just given us a point here.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that Angela's and Ralph's point is what I've been saying has been a constant issue on our minds. But it is for me the very basic answer is around AfrikaBurn being a different animal. And there's a whole other breakout discussion that we can have around the payment of the people who hold the kind of like statutory scaffolding up, which is not a fun job at all. But also the other point that I wanted to make is that in terms of art, that's why it's an open invite. If people are compelled to do a thing and use that experimental space, it's not like we go out and seek artists and say, please, won't you come and do a thing to make our festival successful? We go, here's a space, and some people it tickles, and then they go there.
Thanks, Monique. Nathan, would you like to add something? You're on mute.
And then not much, just maybe also to comment on that thing about what Robert said earlier, just about we're giving them exposure and stuff. That's not a kind of thing that AfrikaBurn to be saying. That's something that artists hear every single day. I'm 56. I'm still working on exposure. And I also don't think we must say that you got to. I don't think we ever use the fact that some people have gotten paying work out of AfrikaBurn to try and justify not paying or try to try to entice people there. I think we just forget about it. People must come build there or not. We mustn't get involved in kind of justifying or trying to lure people there with promises of exposure. I've only got one job from there and I wasn't paid for it. They still owe me the money.
Thanks, Nathan. That's a valid point. You can't eat exposure. Stephen, any last words?
No, look, I mean, I think it is I posted a little comment there that says Department of Sports, Arts and Culture has 4 billion rand, or Arts and Culture has 4 billion rand. Less than 10% of that budget actually gets to creatives. And in fact, I mean, 10% would be fantastic. That would be 400 million rand. The state is not spending 400 million rand is not getting into the pockets of artists. There are just hundreds of administrators and managers and intermediaries and people running facilities and infrastructure who chew up all that money. So I do think that there's a serious crisis actually with respect to the creatives. And I do think that the occupation of the National Arts Council by artists is happening because there's a real desperation, and it's got to change. There's got to be a different way in which things are set up so that there is money available more directly to artists. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Stephen. Tozama Janji says exposure only perpetuates exploitation. Unrabisi, Solitude, do you have one last thing you'd like to say first before we sign out? Mute, my brother, you need to unmute.
Yes, I forget these things, man. What I wanted to say is just for AfrikaBurn, I think it's very important to invest more and more in the principle, each one teach one, because that actually will get us to a point where we need to. I'm saying that because I didn't go into wanting to build an artwork so I can get money, and I didn't have those expectations, but I did want the feeling of being seen as an artist, but also the impact of the logic behind the artwork I wanted to do, because it was not only limited to showcasing my creativity, because I'm not about my own glory, but it's about the purpose behind what I'm trying to do, which I guess it goes back to what I was trying to ask about. What is the point of then doing this thing? Is it because I mean, the question that was in the beginning was whether we uphold or disrupt the status quo. And I guess then my thing would be that there's a way in which we maybe need to look very closely into the line between how different or how unique or how similar we are to the way things are happening. And I think there's a great potential within AfrikaBurn that there's nothing wrong that you guys are doing, and it's actually beautiful. It just needs to be more open and rotate more and more, and being open to teaching everyone who takes interest, and not necessarily be a power structure of holding knowledge from people who do not know enough.
Thank you. Thank you. Lorraine, anything you'd like to add?
I've just seen a WhatsApp, and apparently the books are going to be open tomorrow at the NAC, so there might actually be some movement as to the debacle that's going on there. So that's great news. And I just wanted to reiterate, and we've said it on our last couple of Zoom meetings, that AfrikaBurn absolutely stands behind the artists that are occupying the National Arts Council offices. AfrikaBurn has been impacted by this debacle, and So we're also kind of rallying the background, trying to support in different ways, and also being a network to try and get legal support and that kind of thing. So absolutely, we stand by them. But yeah, I would just want to say thank you everyone for a really engaging session, and yeah, I'll leave that there.
Thanks. Ralph, do you have anything to say before I move on to Monique and then sign off?
5 seconds. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say that I completely agree with Nathan and what everyone says. It's a very complex dance, this artist creative stuff, and yeah, it's a very hard way of navigating how we agree with each other and who's creating, who's producing, etc., etc. So yeah, but it's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. All right, Rolf, you fine? Thank you so much. Monique, would you like to say anything?
Just thank you to everyone, and I miss you all like crazy.
Thank you everybody for joining. Ngiyabonga ngempela that each and every one of you took some time out to join us this evening. Our next installment is on the 7th of April, and it will be our last conversation around this, but I don't think it's going to be our last. Maybe the last of this particular series, and something might be birthday. We continuously have these sessions year in and year out. But 7th of April, look out for it. I will be sending out a newsletter about today so we can share, you know, to other people, like, what did we talk about? What came out of this? What did we learn? What did we feel? So our next one is Watch This Space. We're going to be talking about everything Kwaggafontein. And I'll post some of the questions or the subtopics. So if anybody has any questions, I could actually start to pose them and ask our next panel of speakers. And watch out for this. I'll post out who's going to be our next panel of speakers. It's going to be interesting. So our next one is Watch the Space, Custodianship and Stewardship of Kwaggafontein as a Cultural Space, Ensuring Radical Inclusion Beyond the Week in the Desert. We're going to talk about major art centers in South Africa are traditional in city centers and at distance to communities. So we're going to look at the cultural sector there, measures to ensure equitable access and decision-making to disrupt the norm of gatekeeping. And at destinations for locals as well. So we're going to be talking about all those things, Kwaggafontein. We're going to be tapping into our rural mindsets and talking about the land and accessibility. And of course, the whole conversation is all about inclusivity and the land, transformation and transcendence of this experience. And so with that, I wish you all a good evening. Please, can you all continue to support the NAC artists who are there occupying that space? Make a noise, shout out about it. Thanks to Kyla Davis and her team that are out there every other day, every week, doing puppets and music and anything. And if you're around Johannesburg, go and support them. And yes, tune in on the 7th of April. See you all soon. Thank you all. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you very much, Cindy.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Bas. All right. Bye. Thanks, Solitude. Thanks, Nathan. Enjoy your birthday. Thanks, Stephen too, and Stephen Sack for joining. Yes. Bye, Tozama.